Citizens, fishermen, environmental activists, scientists and governments continue imploring the Japanese government to retract its decision to release over 1 million tonnes of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. For years, experts have been saying the water contaminated at the Fukushima nuclear site 10 years ago may contain quantities of radioactive remains, including carbon-14 and other isotopes, despite an earlier attempt to filter out such substances. But the concerns they have raised about the lingering radioactive elements and the potentially devastating impact on human health, livelihoods and the environment have so far fallen on deaf ears. Today we speak to two people who are leading the international community's response to this controversial decision. Marcos Orellana is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, who released a statement earlier this month to express concern over the impact of Japan's decision. Sean Burney is a senior nuclear specialist with Greenpeace East Asia, who has been working on nuclear issues worldwide for more than 3 decades, including Japan's nuclear policy. Very warm welcome to you both, and welcome back, Mr. Burney. It's lovely to see you both. Thank you for joining us. Now, we're going to go straight into the questions, starting with you, Mr. Orellana. Now, you released a statement earlier this month expressing your disappointment over Japan's decision, but this actually isn't the first time that you and other human rights rapporteurs at the UN raised concerns about the Fukushima plant and its wastewater. What are your biggest concerns, and what has been the Japanese government's response to the times that you did express your worries?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the program. It's my pleasure to be with you. Since the 2011 Fukushima disaster, UN special rapporteurs have consistently written to Japan regarding the implications for health and for other human rights issues of the aftermath of the disaster. For example, the Special Rapporteur on Health conducted an official country visit to Japan in 2012. Rapporteurs have written on internally displaced persons. More than 40,000 people are still internally displaced in Japan and looking for alternatives to build their lives. We have written about children's increased sensitivity to radiation, about concerns over overexposure dose, the monitoring of the health situation, and certainly about the water discharge. And going directly to your question, at this time, our biggest concern regarding the water is the uncertainty. There is not enough information about the risks and impacts of the radioactive water's discharge into the Pacific Ocean over the long term. What are the impacts on human health? What are the impacts on the right to food? What are the impacts on the environment? There's not enough information on what is actually in the water and in what concentrations. We have received responses from Japan, and we value very much the constructive engagement, but we're concerned about the fact that Japan continues to assert that the waters are not contaminated, they have been treated, and they will be treated prior to discharge. Japan argues that that treatment will reduce any contamination to levels below international standards. We regard this response insufficient because the treatment process, so-called ALPS, or Advanced Liquid Processing System, has limitations by design. It is not designed to remove carbon-14. It is not designed to remove tritium. In addition, there are alternative cleaning technologies that can reduce contaminants in the waters to non-detectable levels, which is a standard much stringent and much more protective than the international standards that Japan argues would be achieved with the ALPS treatment. I would also want to add that the first application of the ALPS processing did not succeed, and there is no guarantee that a second application will actually clean the water. And a final point I wish to make on this point is that international standards may not be adequate to offer safe levels of protection. And I say this because scientists are warning that the risks of tritium have been underestimated. And so in regards to these uncertainties, there is high concern about the potential impact and risks about the discharge of contaminated waters by Japan into the Pacific Ocean.
And Mr. Burney, as a nuclear specialist, I know that you've been particularly concerned about this as well. I mean, the IAEA, though, they actually welcomed Japan's decision to discharge its wastewater in the Pacific and said that the procedure will be technically feasible and in line with international practices. But then you've also expressed your concerns about the water processing technology known as ALPS. And, well, is Japan intending on using the same technology the second time round before it discharges the water? And do you think it will work?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back with you again. So the ALPS system was actually first developed in 2011 by a US company and was tested at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. This company called Purolite used its technology with TEPCO, originally had a contract with Hitachi. They have shown me the results of that test, showing that the levels were actually below what's called non-detectable levels. Unfortunately, for various reasons, they didn't proceed with further contracts with Purolite, and Hitachi and Toshiba opted to use, they claim, their own technology. And that's when things started to go seriously wrong in the period 2013 to 2015, which is why you have about 72%, nearly 780,000 cubic meters of the water that's currently in tanks, still with very high levels of radioactive isotopes such as strontium-90, iodine-129. TEPCO conducted a test between September and early October last year of about 2,000 cubic meters of water. This was in a new ALPS facility, very little information about it. The results that they've published so far actually show that they could reduce the levels of strontium-90, for example, to below regulatory limits. That's a higher limit than the below detectable levels. But anyway, they demonstrated it. The problem is it's about 0.25, so less than 1/4% of the water that they have to process over the coming years. And it's really unclear as to whether they're going to be successful. So that's even before we get to the point where they actually would be discharging. And as has been said, that doesn't deal with radioactive tritium, it doesn't deal with radioactive carbon-14. So there's huge uncertainties. TEPCO themselves cannot really say at this stage what they're going to release into the environment, which of course is really not acceptable. Unfortunately, the IAEA has always played a role of supporting the nuclear industry. That's its mandate since 1957, is to promote nuclear energy, and that includes in Japan. And therefore, it is not an environmental protection agency, it's not a public health agency, it's there to support the nuclear industry. And it's what we would expect from the agency itself.
Now, Mr. Orellana, the IAEA has talked about putting together a technical team to really oversee Japan's wastewater disposal process. Do you think this is a sufficient solution to this problem that we have at the moment, or do you think this is a mechanism that they really should have had in the first place?
I will argue that the challenge at this time is not in the technical oversight of discharge. The challenge at this time is in the adoption of a decision that is grounded on science and technology. The IAEA could help Japan and other countries in the region in the conduct of an environmental impact assessment. This tool would study risks in detail and comprehensively. It would also study alternatives and options in detail. And EIA would enable consultations at the technical level and also at the highest political level between Japan and its neighbors in the region. The International Atomic Energy Agency's announcement and support of Japan, I will argue, is also problematic for other reasons as well. I certainly welcome Japan's cooperation with the agency, but the agency's support of Japan can compromise its independence. There are global public interests at play here, so why favor the economic interests of one of its members to the detriment of global public interests? Why support Japan and not support other countries? We are left to speculate, but one thing is clear. The International Atomic Energy Agency has a mandate to accelerate and enlarge peaceful atomic energy. I'm quoting from its charter. The Fukushima waters and its contamination are seen by some observers as a challenge, as a threat to the viability of this mandate. Let me give you an example. In its briefings to diplomatic missions in Tokyo, Japan has made the argument that tritium is routinely discharged from nuclear power plants. But common practice is not the same as safe practice. As scientists are warning about the dangers of tritium, they're highlighting the risks to human health and the marine environment, especially of organically bound tritium, which can go up the food chain and link and bond with algae and fish and eventually impact and expose humans. This poses not just a threat or a challenge to the discharge of Fukushima waters, it poses a challenge to the operation of nuclear power plants around the world if they discharge tritium into the marine environment or into the environment more generally.
Well, Mr. Burney, now Greenpeace Japan says it gathered more than 180,000 petitions from South Korea and Japan opposing the decision to release wastewater into the Pacific. What changes have you been calling for, and what would be a safer way of disposing of the wastewater, or at least dealing with the problem that Japan claims it has, its tank storage issue?
Unfortunately, the Japanese government has sort of ignored the reality on the ground at Fukushima Daiichi. The capacity is said to be running out by 2022, but in cross-examination of TEPCO in 2018, in the subcommittee which I was at in Tokyo, TEPCO admitted that there was storage space on the site itself, and the government's own report, which was issued last February, confirmed that land was available outside the perimeter fence. The fundamental problem is that the contaminated water is still arising every day, be 140, 150 cubic meters. That's predicted to go on for the coming years. There's no solution at the moment. So the source of that problem is the molten fuel in the reactors underneath the reactor pressure vessels. Hundreds of tons of highly radioactive fuel that melted down in 2011. So long as groundwater keeps coming onto that site, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water will continue to arise. The government has chosen to say that it can clean all of this up within a matter of a few decades. That's not credible. They're ignoring the options of building additional storage. There's no option here that is not without risks. We don't deny that long-term storage also has risks, but the uncontrolled release of radioactivity into the environment is effectively an experiment on the environment and public health, and is clearly not an option that the Japanese government should pursue.
And Mr. Oriana, because of these possibilities and these possible risks, South Korea, Taiwan and China, they were and still very alarmed by Japan's announcement. Seoul and Beijing officials talked amongst themselves, and they said they would consider diplomatic and legal action against this. But observers, they are saying that perhaps their efforts might be futile, as the IAEA and the US, they appear to be backing Tokyo's decision. Do you see a way out of this? Would there perhaps be a way of formally appealing against Japan's decision to a higher or international body?
Countries in the region certainly have the right to protect their territories. And in fact, they not only have the right, but they have the duty under international law to protect their population from environmental risks. If we look back in time, we see that Australia and New Zealand brought legal action before the International Court of Justice against France in the 1970s for the impacts of atmospheric nuclear tests. You mentioned South Korea, Taiwan, China, but also the countries of the Pacific Forum have voiced their concern regarding Japan's decision to discharge contaminated waters into the Pacific. I would want to highlight that in the South Pacific, the Treaty of Rarotonga creates a nuclear-free zone that prohibits the dumping of radioactive wastes. At a global level, the London Dumping Convention also prohibits the dumping of radioactive wastes. If we look back in time at the inception of the Treaty of Rarotonga in the mid-1970s, Japan voiced its concern and opposed nuclear dumping in the Pacific. On your point about the United States, it is certainly true that the United States appeared to back Japan's decision. And this comes as a surprise because President Joe Biden, in his first days in office, signed executive orders to restore the centrality of science in environmental decision-making and policy-making. I would submit and argue that the United States should follow this directive not only in its internal affairs, but also in its international relations. There is certainly room for constructive diplomacy carried out in constructive spirit. There's also room for legal action. One of the keystone obligations in modern international law is the duty of states to prevent transboundary harm. This obligation carries several steps, such as the elaboration of an environmental impact assessment. International law also requires, it obliges states to carry out consultations in good faith, in a constructive spirit, prior to any plan or decision that may pose a significant risk to the environment. In the past, countries in the region have announced that they will look at legal avenues, such as the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. If we look at precedent, Australia and New Zealand have brought legal action against Japan in the past for overfishing of southern bluefin tuna in the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Also, Australia, with New Zealand intervening, brought legal action against Japan before the International Court of Justice regarding Japanese commercial whaling conducted under the guise of scientific research. So there is really no obstacle to countries in the region seizing legal avenues to protect their rights and the rights of their citizens.
Well, really, unfortunately, this human rights issue, this environmental rights issue, seems to be rather a test of whether these powerful countries will politicize the agenda or choose to listen to the concerns coming from civil society, scientists, activists, and governments. Well, I'm afraid we will have to end the interview here today as we're out of time. I do apologise for that. But that was Marcos Orellana, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and Sean Burney, Senior Nuclear Specialist with Greenpeace East Asia. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.